Welcome back. The panel is here. NBC News Chief Washington Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, Leanne Caldwell, Chief Washington Correspondent for Puck, Ashley Etienne, former Communications Director for Vice President Harris, and Marc Short, former Director of Legislative Affairs for President Trump. Thank you all for being here on this Labor Day weekend. Andrea, let me start with you, because there's been so much focus on President Trump, his administration's attempts to have control over these agencies that are typically immune from politics. What's the fallout that your sources are telling you about?
There is huge fallout. Officials, business executives, medical experts, doctors who are trusted and experienced, scientists, intelligence experts, they're all angry, they're frustrated, and it's having a big impact because we hear about the CDC, people worried about COVID, flu vaccines, mRNA being canceled. The Fed, the independence of the Fed goes back to 1951. This can affect not only our economy, but the global economy. I talk to central bankers elsewhere around the world who are really concerned. But now there's also a fundamental change. Our intelligence community, we are now lacking cybersecurity, counterterrorism security. Experts have been fired, decimated. State Department. We're talking about the Bureau of Labor Statistics, of course, but there's also the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So nuclear safety, our nuclear plants. Talk about the EPA. Whistleblowers are being silenced in FEMA, in the EPA, and now this challenge, the pocket rescissions, where they are doing it for a loophole that has been declared illegal by the GAO and by the Supreme Court back in the 70s. And now you've got pocket rescissions with very little time, and Congress is basically not standing up. So it is an executive that is undeterred because Congress has been feckless.
Well, okay, you take me to my next point. I mean, it's a sweeping picture that Andrea paints, Leanne, and I think the question for Congress, particularly on the heels of them coming back from their summer recess, will there be any red lines for Republicans? I know you've been working your sources on that angle.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kristen. So for the past 8 months, Republicans, except for a few outliers, have been in lockstep with this administration, not standing up to anything. For the first time, my sources are starting to express a little bit of trepidation about what the president is doing, my Republican sources. How is that going to manifest on the Hill when they come back next week? That's still to be, that's uncertain. One thing is the Federal Reserve. They could block a nominee moving through the Federal Reserve. But when it comes to issues like pocket rescissions, it's going to be up to the leadership on if they want to block this, and it doesn't sound like they're willing to do it, despite this is a move by the administration to move around Congress and almost make Congress obsolete.
Mark, you know, it's interesting. You have some of the president's critics calling these moves dictatorial. You heard him make that reference. And on the other hand, they're calling him a socialist for wanting to buy stake in Intel. How is this playing?
Well, I think it is where the populist and the progressive movements come together, frankly, Kristen, because in many cases, I think voters elected Donald Trump because they did want him to fire people. It felt like the federal government was too big and it was time to shrink the size and scope of the government. And I'm one who supports many of those decisions. Having said that, on the trade agenda and on seizing control of Intel, it's like the Democrats nominate a mayor in New York who says, I'm going to take control of the grocery stores, and this administration is like, hold my beer. Watch me. I'm going to seize means of production with Intel, and I'm going to take golden shares of U.S. Steel, and even worse, on NVIDIA, you know, it's a national security concern. They say we're not going to allow sales. They say, okay, we can have sales as long as you give us 15%. And it's not surprising that the only two senators who spoke out in favor of this were Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And Republicans, other than Rand Paul, have been silent on this issue. And it's rather shocking to see them seize means of production in this way, particularly when less than 20 years ago, the whole Tea Party movement was largely launched because Washington, D.C., after the Wall Street bailout, was taking dollars from Main Street and subsidizing Wall Street. That's what energized our base initially less than 20 years ago. And now we're basically seizing means of production from private companies.
Ashley, you know, all of this is taking place against the backdrop of the midterm elections. And I know that you are outlining actually a strategy for Democrats heading into the midterms. They are trying to re-find their footing against this political backdrop in the second Trump administration. What is it you are suggesting?
So I'm suggesting that the Democratic Party lean into a message framework of culture of corruption to highlight Donald Trump's corruption. At the heart of Trump's administration is this issue of corruption. We've seen the cover-up of the Epstein files, the stripping more than 15 million Americans of their health care to give tax cuts to the rich, the stealing of personal private data of more than 500 million Americans and handing that over to his biggest donor. And many of the issues we're talking about today, the hostile takeover of the Federal Reserve to American cities, all of that needs to be packaged up and put in a prism in which the American people can understand how Trump's authoritarianism, his lawlessness, and his failed economy is impacting them. And I think this issue of corruption is a winning one. We've seen it win in 2006 in the midterms, in 2018 when I was running communications for Pelosi, and I think it can win again.
So Democrats see an opening around that message and around some of the seats that are opening up. Mark, Joni Ernst expected to announce she's not running for re-election. When you hear what Ashley says, do you think that could play in a state like Iowa and elsewhere?
Ashley's going to know her base a lot better than I do. To me, it's not compelling because I don't think anything that Trump is doing is secret to the American people. And I think it's particularly rich after the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden presidency to say we're going to focus on corruption. I do think that Republicans have a bigger challenge when it comes to the economy because Donald Trump was elected on the economy and the border. And as if this trade agenda continues to weaken the labor market, I think that creates a bigger risk for Republicans heading into the midterms.
Just to push back on what Mark just said, 60% of the country already believes that the president is corrupt, and that's across the political spectrum, not just Democrats.
And Andrea, that is going to be a big issue. We're seeing Democratic governors so far take the lead right now. I mean, they're not necessarily the ones up in the midterms, but they're to some extent really taking the lead on a lot of these.
Well, that's because they're looking at 2028. They are the most likely candidate in 2028. When you look at Governor Newsom, who's taking the lead, he has been, trolling the president, going online, and what he does, he certainly is the most prominent opponent right now for the Democrats, but he risks being seen as unserious. And right now, I think the White House is looking at Governor Pritzker. That's why they're talking about going to Chicago. But in part, yes, they have a homicide rate, but they see Pritzker as a possibly serious opponent. The one thing I would caution, though, getting back to what Ashley's talking about, the economy is all important, but I think that crime and immigration are such big issues for Republicans. The president spoke of it as a potential trap for Democrats, and they have to be very cautious about how strongly they oppose the National Guard.
All right. Well, we will have to leave it there. Thank you all for being here.